Hello and welcome to Newslaundry Interviews. Today we have with us Ananth Krishnan, China correspondent with The Hindu. He is here to discuss his book with us, India's China Challenge. Welcome to Newslaundry, Ananth.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Ananth, as we discussed before this interview, I want to talk to you as much about China and China alone. And I want to do this because, and this is my thesis, that we in India tend to understand how a democracy functions, be it the US, the UK, or even France, with which we have a language divide in a sense. We don't understand this entirely different operating system, which is the People's Republic of China, right? So I want you to hold forth for a few minutes and tell us, how does China's political and governance framework work?
I think the most important, simple thing that I would say to everybody is to keep in mind that even if you have the veneer or facade of having institutions like a parliament or the Supreme Court in China, the fact is that actually all of these answer to the Communist Party of China. So it's an entirely different system. And since I write this for an Indian audience, I try and make an example of trying to get people to imagine, God forbid, if you had a political party in India, whether BJP or Congress, that was in charge of the army, that controlled the army, that appointed the generals, that appointed the editors of every newspaper who have to be party members, that appointed the chancellors of every university who have to be party members, who appointed the head of every bank, and who even controlled your resident welfare association, who would be headed by a party member. So that's, in a nutshell, how sort of ubiquitous the Communist Party is.
Can you just give us a little bit of a flavor as to what is their version of a parliament? Like, do they have upper house, a lower house, or do they have three houses? What's it like?
Essentially, you can think of a parallel structure where you have government machinery and party machinery, but ultimately the party would supersede the government machinery, and that's how it works. And if the parliament is really interesting because it meets once a year in March. And for me, it was one of the more interesting 2 weeks in Beijing. I always look forward to it. And so you have this very choreographed theater for 2 weeks where all these MPs meet in Beijing at the Great Hall of the People. They deliberate on motions. They never reject anything that's put forward before them. But frankly, the important thing to remember is it's a one-party show, and now it's become a one-man show.
You highlight in your book that there was the Chinese state and the party, CCP, came into a form of compact with the citizenry of China post Tiananmen Square violence. And this compact was that as long as the state and the party delivered growth, the demands for civil liberties and freedoms might not be as acute. So this was a compact. Now, how is Xi managing this compact, given that the growth rates are declining and that they will eventually plateau? What's kept Xi in power, even though he's not meeting the criteria he's supposed to?
So I think it's a good question, and I think that's at the heart of what determines whether the CPC will stay in power, and it determines their policies as well. I think that the challenge going forward is going to be that I think the generation that was, say, born in the 60s and 70s, people now in their 50s and above. So I think that their kind of tolerance for economic downturn, I would say, is generally quite high because they grew up in the Cultural Revolution. They grew up in the 80s, so they've seen all of this. I think the big question for me would be those who are born in the 90s and the 2000s, who aren't used to any of that, who have grown up with only plenty. And how that generation would deal with a prolonged downturn. From my own experience, I often found that younger Chinese, those born in the 90s and 2000s, strike me as much more nationalistic than those born previously, in terms of being critical of the government, in terms of being very sensitive about acknowledging mistakes that the party has made. And I think that
you make a really interesting point about rising nationalism in China. What I'm trying to get at here is that is the citizenry that is born in the 90s and in the early 2000s and even sort of the middle 2000s, are they actually buying into this revisionist history of China? Or do you see some form of, or any corner of resistance to this
I can't stress this enough that there is a diversity of views among people you meet, whether, say, a rural Chinese 22-year-old would have a completely different perspective from someone who is born in Beijing, studied abroad, open to many things. So there's a whole, and you have a huge number of Chinese studying abroad. And even among them, the diversity is so interesting that you have a large chunk of them who go abroad who become super nationalistic. And you have a chunk of them who go abroad and become very critical and really see the values of living in a liberal, open society. There is genuine pride as well. Like there is, in a way, some of it it's easy to dismiss as being sort of manufactured because you read it in your textbooks that every Chinese reads that China suffered 100 years of humiliation. They were kept down, there were unequal treaties, they finally fought back against all these incredible odds, and this is their time, right? So everybody reads this in the textbooks. And so obviously that's something that the state wants to hammer into people. I think among young people, this turn towards pride is something that I think is happening everywhere. But I would say in China, it's interesting. I would say there is a diversity of views among those in cities as well. I think many people that I've met, younger people who are quite frustrated by the last 7-8 years and the direction that she was taking. There was actually a sense of pride also in the fact that China was opening up. And a lot of people are frustrated that in the 21st century, they can't access the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or even Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, things that young kids all over the world are doing.
I have been to China about 4 or 5 times now. And the first thing that I noticed when I landed up in China was the great digital wall of China, which you just alluded to, that there's no Twitter, there's no Facebook, there's no Gmail. So what is on Chinese social media feeds? What do the Chinese people actually think? What do they think of the world? What do they think of their place in the world? And what do they think of countries such as India in their neighborhood?
No, it's a completely two-way street. And in some sense, I would say that the sense of disconnect is worse in terms of from the Chinese view, because just to give you one small example, I think many people in China right now are under the impression that their recovery from COVID-19 over the last few months has been such a great feat that many people in China are under the impression that the world is actually in some weird sense grateful or in some sense, looking with a great sense of positivity at China's accomplishments in overcoming COVID-19.
You say that the censors play a major role in the information that's put out in China. So just taking off from that, I was just thinking then, what do like the newspapers or the television news channels, if they can't sort of report on politics, policy, or performance, what do they report on? Is it just sort of China is great?
The newspapers and the television channels are entirely boring, and that's the reason why most people that I know don't read them. But here in India, we think that, like every second person in China is waking up and reading the Global Times. A lot of people I know roll their eyes at the Global Times as this sort of, this hyper-nationalistic rag. So even within China, there is some skepticism among, I'd say, especially among urban elites, especially before Xi took over in 2012. The media landscape in China was very diverse. So you had official-ish papers like the People's Daily, Global Times, which people would kind of shrug their shoulders at. But you also had kind of other media that the party kind of allowed to come up in the early mid-2000s, which would do muckraking stuff within the limits. Like they would report on corruption among local government, but the holy cows would be the central leadership.
मुफ्त खोरो, मुफ्त में इतना ही मिलेगा. To watch the full unedited interview, you have to subscribe to News Laundry and pay to keep news free. Because when the public pays, the public is served. We depend on you and not on advertisers. So go to www.newslaundry.com/subscription and subscribe and get all our unedited interviews, our special video shows, comics, and everything that's behind the paywall. Remember, to subscribe to News Laundry, you pay just about 10 rupees a day. That's less than, well, no, a cigarette. And smoking is injurious to health. So subscribe and watch the full interview.